Hey guys, we're back, and this is our last video lesson for Chapter 8, Genetics of Behavior. Today we're going to talk about Section 4, which looks at mood disorders, and Section 5, which looks at schizophrenia. All right, and then of course, since this is our last one, you will also notice that there are our additional resources at the end. And so we'll get to those in a little bit. And you guys ready? Set? All right, let's go. I'm going to start by talking about mood disorders. So mood disorders represent the extremes of normal behavior and are difficult to separate into genetic and environmental components. Many people will experience some of these or mood disorders as, let me try this one more time. Most people will experience some sort of mood disorder at some point in their life. Now, just like with all the other behavioral genetics we've looked at, some of these there are genetic versions of mood disorders, but there are also purely environmental versions of mood disorders. And a lot of times with the genetic ones, just like with the other things we've talked about, they need some kind of environmental trigger to start them. Because the symptoms of a number of mood disorders are so similar, it oftentimes is very difficult to diagnose them. But that's why they come up with like different tests and all that, where you can answer questions and they can at least narrow it down to one or two possible options for mood disorders. So here's just kind of looking at the overall chart of anxiety and mood disorders. A lot of times these are kind of classified together because when you have anxiety, it causes you to behave and affects your mood in different ways. So a lot of times we'll kind of put these together, but they are slightly separate. So if we're looking at just pure anxiety disorders, there's PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome, panic disorder, OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, as well as phobia. So those irrational fears. And then for mood disorders, we generally talk about those in terms of two main ones. There's depression, which can be further divided into dysthymic disorder and major depressive disorder. And then bipolar disorders, we have bipolar 1 disorder, bipolar 2 disorder, and cyclothymic disorder. All right. So what are some of the factors? Oh, so many things. So we can talk about it in terms of, genetics, that's there. And then we have all these other things, spirituality, culture, structural, immune inflammation, infection. So certain infections can lead to a change in some of your biochemistry, and that can lead to a mood disorder. Early trauma, detoxification, so going through withdrawal after you've been addicted to a drug and you go through withdrawal, that oftentimes will lead to depression. Psychosocial factors, nutritional, digestive, and dietary factors, endocrine, so your hormones, when they get out of whack for whatever reason, whether it's due to stress, genetics, etc., that will affect and can lead to a mood disorder. Energy production, oxidative stress. So those are more so things that go on in the cells that once again can affect those hormone levels and lead to a mood disorder. So many different things. And this is why it gets really difficult to classify, categorize, and treat these. All right, let's talk a little bit about depression and bipolar disorders. Now, what they found is that both of them are very likely due to a deficiency of serotonin. They definitely know that depression is due to, or most depressions are due to a deficiency in serotonin. They're still kind of working out right now a bit more about bipolar. Let's see. So depression affects about 6% of the population, and bipolar or manic depression affects about 1%. If those numbers seem a little low, Let me tell you why. The reason why those are so low is because these are looking at the genetic versions of these. So depression caused by genetic factors and bipolar caused by genetic factors. If you take in the purely environmental versions of these, yes, the numbers would be much higher. These are looking at the genetic versions. But since we're talking about that, yeah, there are a lot of versions of these, many versions of these that are caused by purely environmental factors. For instance, you may not have any genes that could lead to depression or bipolar disorder, but if you go through some kind of trauma as a child, if you were physically or mentally or sexually abused as a child, or if someone close to you dies, someone that you love dearly, whether it is a significant other, your best friend, a family member, all of those are going to lead, can very likely lead to depression. Going through a divorce can lead to depression. So there are versions that are purely based on circumstances in the world around you and how they affect you. But in terms of this 6% and 1%, that's looking at the genetic variation. So something in the genes that even if there's no reason for you to be depressed, if you have a wonderful, amazing, incredible life, but you still experience depression, it could be because of these genetic factors. Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs, have become popular treatments replacing the older tricyclic drugs. So what that means is, and we're actually going to look at over here how SSRIs work. It's a new form of treatment that helps the body to use the serotonin more effectively so that it has the effect that it should have. Serotonin is another happy hormone, and a lot of times in depression, the serotonin, either there's, your body could be, again, talking about the genetic version, maybe you're, according to your genes, it's not making enough serotonin, so your serotonin production is low, or the receptors aren't working the way that they should. So even though you have enough serotonin, the receptors aren't picking them up like they should and reacting with them. Either way, it means that it's going to be harder to send that signal of happiness across, thus leading to depression. Now, I do want to say that when we talk about depression, it doesn't mean that you are sad all the time. There's a lot of different ways that someone who's depressed feels. Sadness is actually just a little itty bitty tiny bit of it. It can be being sleepless, insomniac, or even sleeping too much. It can be a feeling of worthlessness, of not being good enough, of wondering why you're still alive. Should you even deserve to be alive? Aren't you just a waste of space? And there's so many different ways that, and so many feelings that someone with depression can have. And it actually does get kind of scary for that person at times, which is why oftentimes people who are depressed do have thoughts of suicide. It seems like a good escape. It seems like they're doing everyone around them a favor by not being a burden. But again, that's not the case. And if you are feeling that way, please definitely seek help. Talk to a doctor, talk to a friend, talk to a teacher, talk to someone you trust. All right. Although depression has been correlated with deficiencies in serotonin transporter, assigning specific genes to bipolar disorder has been difficult. What we mean by that is, with depression, you're kind of always on one side of the emotional spectrum, the darker side. With someone with bipolar disorder, they jump from one extreme to the other. So they can be like super happy and jubilant one moment and then very quickly switch to very highly depressed. And because of these massive switches, they're not quite sure what's going on with bipolar disorder in terms of the hormone levels yet. They're still studying it. For the longest time, bipolar disorder was just classified as another version of depression. So it was being treated the same as depression, but the outcomes weren't, the treatments weren't really helping people all that much. And that's, you know, as technology got better, we learned more about it, and we realized that it's something completely different. That's not just staying on this side of the emotional spectrum, it's bouncing between the two sides. And that means that there's something else going on. So we're still studying it. We're still trying to figure out what it is. They do have some treatments out there, but, you know, they're working on it to see what's the best course of treatment right now. All right, so speaking about the, speaking about the emotional spectrum, this is kind of what it looks like. So most of us kind of, you know, hang out here. We might kind of bounce a little bit depending on certain situations. Dysthymia, mild depression, moderate depression, severe depression, and severe depression with psychosis. So when we mention major depressive disorder, that's usually around here, but it could also involve with psychosis. So this would be around the major depressive disorder side. If you have some sort of depressive disorder, usually, depending on the degree of it, it's going to range between these. Recurrent depressive disorder means that, you know, you spend sometimes pretty normal, happy, and whatever, but then you do have these periods where you do spiral into depression, but then you go back to normal. And then if we look at the other end, we have elation, hypomania, mania with psychosis. And someone with bipolar disorder is going to actually bounce throughout the entire spectrum. And they can go from mania to severe depression at, you know, the drop of a dime. It can be a very quick turnaround. And that's why we know that there's something different going on. And we have to figure out exactly what's going on in order to find the best course of treatment. So brain scans is just showing you some of the brain scans of different anxiety or mood disorders. So this looks at a normal brain. This is the brain of someone with OCD. You can see how different parts of it are lighting up. So that tells us something is going on differently. Bipolar disorder. So again, different parts are lit up than you see in the normal one. And depression. Again, you see certain differences going on here than the normal one. And even here, this shows the difference in activity between when someone's in a depressed state versus a manic state. So even as someone with bipolar, when they switch, there's this rapid change in which parts of their brain are active. So it can go from this to this or vice versa. All right, so how SRIs work. Now, what happens is the neuron secretes the serotonin. It kind of, you know, bounces around. It hits receptors for a while, and that's passing on the feeling. Once the serotonin hits the receptors, that passes on that happy feeling or feeling of contentment from one neuron to the other. Now, after they bounce around, passed on the feeling of happiness, then they get reabsorbed back into the neuron and stored until the next time they need to be released. However, sometimes what happens is either not enough of the serotonin is being produced and released, so there's not as much down here to hit the receptors before it gets reabsorbed, or maybe not all the receptors are working, so since if half the receptors aren't working, you're only going to get half the effect before the serotonin gets reabsorbed. So you're not getting the full effect of it. How SSRIs work is they will actually temporarily block that reuptake channel. So that means that even if there's less serotonin being produced, it'll have more time to bounce around and thus more time to activate all of the receptors. Or if not all the receptors are working, then you have more time where the existing serotonin can take turns re-stimulating the working receptors over and over and over before the SSRI leaves, and then they can finally be reabsorbed back in. So in other words, it allows the serotonin more time with the receptors in order to finally generate that, normal happy feeling before it gets reabsorbed. Now, something I do also want to clarify with these is there is a huge stigma in our society about mental disorders. Let me ask you something. If someone was diabetic, would you tell them not to take insulin, that they should just get over it? They should just, think better thoughts and lower their blood pressure or change their blood sugar levels, by sheer force of will? If someone has a thyroid issue, would you tell them not to take the medicine for it? If someone has a broken leg, would you tell them just to walk it off? No, of course you wouldn't. That's horrible. Those people have legitimate medical needs. Well, so does someone who's going through a mental disorder or a mental health issue, whether it is genetically caused or environmentally caused. They need help. And it breaks my heart when I hear people who have no experience with depression or bipolar disorder telling other people, man, you just gotta be happy. You just gotta get over it. Go for a walk outside. You'll feel better. Don't worry about taking medicine. You don't need to put that stuff in your body. Well, yeah, they do. I mean, if their body is not making enough serotonin, then what's the harm in taking a medicine that helps them use the serotonin that they do make more effectively? In diabetes, the body doesn't make insulin, but we're okay telling someone with diabetes to take the supplementary insulin in place of it to keep them, alive and healthy. Well, why can't we say that to someone who's going through depression, that it's okay to take medicine to help them so they stay happy and they're not suicidal, so they stay alive? Please be more understanding. Please be more caring to those individuals. This is a huge problem, and it is something that I am advocating for, that being depressed, being bipolar, it doesn't make you weak. You're actually incredibly strong for dealing with it. And I don't want anyone to tell you otherwise. Yeah, that's my PSA for today. All right, so on that note, let's talk a little bit about schizophrenia. So schizophrenia is a disorder that affects thought and perception. So a debilitating loss of the ability to organize thought and perception, and often leads to withdrawal from reality. What that means is that it's not uncommon for certain symptoms such as delusions, hallucinations, hearing voices. They can actually change how the person perceives reality around them. And because of this, it could be very difficult to diagnose. And that's because it affects their thinking rather than their mood. But by affecting their thinking, their perception, and their organization of their thoughts, by affecting that, it does affect how they feel and thus affects their mood. Now, I have some pictures that were drawn by people with schizophrenia, and it shows you, the first picture is when they're lucid, meaning that they're not in the middle of a schizophrenic episode. So this person drew a cat, I believe that's Louis Wayne, and this person drew a face. But then as you see, it shows a progression from lucid to revving up into a schizophrenic episode to when they are in a full-blown episode. Same with the cat. This is how they perceive a cat normally when they are beginning to enter a schizophrenic episode. And this is how he perceived the cat when he was in a schizophrenic episode. Yeah, three people we're going to look at. Let's look at first Lewis Wayne's cats. So again, you see the first few are lucid, and then we're leading up to the schizophrenic episode, and you can see how it's changed as the schizophrenia gets stronger. And we have the next one will be William Utramolin's self-portraits. Yep. So again, these are looking at, in this case, is how he perceived himself during his life. This was before he had schizophrenia. And then it's not just that you see him getting older. As the schizophrenia got worse and worse, you see how his perception of himself changed. So these are self-portraits. In 1999, this is how he actually viewed himself, how he perceived himself. This is how he viewed himself in 2000. So it's really kind of shocking how it goes from, even from 98 to 2000, how that perception changes. And Kate Fenner's hallucination art. So she's a young girl who has recently been recognized as kind of advocating and showing awareness for schizophrenia by showing her artwork that she does while she's going through schizophrenic episodes. So here are some of her works. And in the different articles, it even mentions that these are the hallucinations that she has. So when she's going through a schizophrenic episode, these are things that she sees in the world around her, things that she perceives around her, whether it's sitting on a desk or whispering in her ear. These are what she sees and hears. So it just kind of gives you a glimpse into what that's like. Let's talk a little bit about the genetics of it. So high heritability and risk of recurrence suggests a genetic component in schizophrenia. So it is suggested that there is a strong genetic component, but it is not purely genetic, it is multifactorial. Concordance in twins also demonstrates that a significant environmental component exists in schizophrenia. The concordance between identical twins is 40%, which is high, but it's still not like a super high guarantee. I mean, it's almost half, 50%. So, but what I mean by that is there's still 60% of identical twins who, if one has schizophrenia, the other doesn't. So the fact that there's still 60% non-concordance would suggest that there is also a significant environmental component as well. So familial studies have implicated numerous loci in schizophrenia in terms of the genes. They're also looking at environmental causes, some of which can include poor nutrition as a growing fetus. It could affect how the brain is organized, and that can lead to schizophrenia in the future. So this is an example of a drawing test they might use or to see if someone has schizophrenia. So they'll ask you to draw a tree, and they'll tell you, all right, its shape, let you know its width. So does the trunk have, the right shape? Does it have the right width? Top end, does that look kind of right? At the top is the base end. At the base, how does it look? The roots, are there any roots? What about the root ends? Crossing, visibility. And you can see how, okay, that looks like a tree. That one, you can tell it's a tree, but you also kind of, are curious about, okay, what else is going on? Because even someone who can't draw can probably draw one better than that. But this one here, that's definitely telling us something is up, because they're drawing how they perceive a tree. And if you look at that, you get some very different shapes. So you notice how the scoring changes. You get all zeros, you're good. This one might indicate that there's something going on in terms of neural connections and perception, but maybe not necessarily schizophrenia. This one means definitely schizophrenia. Here's a brain scan going from healthy, high risk for schizophrenia, and then someone with schizophrenia. Again, you can see how different parts of the brain are lit up. Seeing more brain scans. So healthy, high risk, and someone with schizophrenia. Now you can definitely see that there are changes, not just in ways that it's lighting up. Lighting up is when there's activity, but also just in terms of the shape of parts of the gray matter are changing. And that's kind of showing you here as well. This is early and late gray matter deficits, in schizophrenia. So you see that there are, some cases of deficits or loss of gray matter in the early stages, but then 5 years later, it's the exact same person, you can see a lot bigger changes. So some of the genes that they're looking for are genes related to two hormones, dopamine and glutamate. What they've noticed is that these levels are severely altered in schizophrenics. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those. So for instance, dopamine, it's a neurotransmitter associated with pleasure. So it's a happy, pleasurable hormone. It's the feel-good chemical. Now, normal brain, you see a few small areas of dopamine, but then in someone with schizophrenia, we see these larger, elevated levels of it. So we see higher amounts of dopamine coming through, as opposed to glutamate, which is a neurotransmitter responsible for almost every major excitatory brain function. So it is one that it affects a lot of the different transmission rates throughout the different neurotransmitters within the brain. And that's why it's considered one of the most important neurotransmitters. But what we see is someone with schizophrenia, that there's actually less amounts of it. So the glutamate levels lower, and they thought that the thought is that the lower glutamate levels could be the result, or could result in the disorganization of thought and the kind of break from reality, where they perceive reality in different ways. It's because these aren't firing as they should be. Now, if you're interested in more about schizophrenia in terms of seeing the perception side of it, there's a movie starring Russell Crowe and Jennifer Connelly, I believe, called A Beautiful Mind. It's based on the true story of brilliant mathematician John Nash, and he has schizophrenia. So it's interesting seeing his perception of the world around him versus everyone else's perception. So if you're interested, I definitely recommend you check out the movie A Beautiful Mind. In the meantime, let's go on with our additional resources. So Science in Pajamas, we just have one on behavioral genetics, just kind of a summation of some of the things we've talked about. And then other videos, we got a lot of them. I'm not going to go through and click all of them, but just like always, I will have the link for this Prezi in the video description so that you guys can have access to it and you can have access to all these links. So we have one by the Audiopedia on what is behavioral genetics, Scientific American, how do genes influence behavior? Why not? So that's the Audiopedia, Scientific American, how do genes, oh, I gotta go back and put that one in. That will be in when this is all fixed, all right? As soon as I'm done recording, I will go back and fix that. Genetics in Eating Disorders by the Eating Recovery Center. Let's see. Crash Course, Eating and Body Dysmorphia Disorders. Khan Academy, Sleep Disorders. Sleep Hub, Circadian Rhythm Disorders. So that would include like FASTs. ASAP Science, Can We Genetically Improve Intelligence? CCACE Video, Genetics of Intelligence and Neuroticism. TED Talk, Addiction in the Age of Brain Science. Professor Dave Explains, Drug Addiction and the Brain. Crash Course, Depressive and Bipolar Disorders. ASAP Science, The Science of Depression. And then we have Crash Course, Schizophrenia and Dissociative Disorders. And Khan Academy, about schizophrenia. So by the time you view this, I will fix that Scientific American link. So it will be there in the actual presentation when you click on the link. But in the meantime, I hope this helped you guys out. Hope it was informative. Just take care, you guys. Stay awesome, stay amazing, stay curious, and stay safe and healthy. All right, you guys, take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.